Thank you for joining us on American Medicine Today. I'm Kimberly Bermel, joined by my friends Ethan Euchre.
Glad to be here.
And Jeff Wagstaff.
Thanks for having me.
Our next guest is a complete medical marvel. Doctors claim he is the only person in the world to have lived after having 5 arteries severed. And they can't explain why. He also claims to have had a near-death experience that convinced him that angels are among us. He is Bruce Van Natta. Thanks for being here, Bruce.
Well, thanks for having me on the show.
What an incredible story.
Yeah, it's even been featured on the Discovery Channel. The History Channel has featured Bruce's story. So take us back to that day in November of 2006 and how an accident changed your life forever, Bruce.
I owned a company where I went around and did on-site diesel repair, and that particular day I was working on a huge Peterbilt logging truck. This truck is about as big as any semi-truck you're going to see anywhere. The mechanic that actually worked at that place had jacked that truck up in the front. These big trucks, they got a big axle in the front. The weight on those 2 front tires is like 10 to 12,000 pounds, so 5 to 6 tons of weight on the axle. He jacked that axle up, removed one of the wheels. I just finished up the engine repair. It was at the end of the day. I was just getting ready to go home, and the guy said, "Hey, before you go, could you look at one more thing?" And he had an oil leak in the front of this engine, so I ended up going underneath the truck, underneath this big axle that was jacked up, laying on a creeper, a little tool that mechanics use to go underneath vehicles. So I went underneath the axle, and he went up inside the truck. The jack slipped out, and when he did, that axle came down and crushed me across the middle like a blunt guillotine. So you have like 10 to 12,000 pounds of weight coming down and just crashing to the cement. And the only thing that was between it and the cement was my body. So on impact, when this thing crushed me, basically it fell between my ribs and my pelvic. From the left to the right, side to side is where the axle was, and I was laying parallel with the center line of the truck, just underneath the front. And so when it fell and crashed across the middle of me, blood actually shot up out from the inside of my body, out of my mouth, and landed a big blob next to my head. I just called out and said, "God help me!" And the guy got down to the truck, and he went into shock when he saw my body crushed in half. There was like 1 inch of space between the bottom of the axle and the cement on the left side, and 2 inches on the right side. So my body was 1 inch thick on the left, 2 inches thick on the right, and the space from the bottom of your ribs to your pelvic all the way across there was flat like a pancake. The guy just completely lost it, and I was begging him to call 911. He called 911. He couldn't figure out how to get it up off of me because he had the jack underneath the axle. The axle's now on the cement.
I can't believe you stayed conscious, Bruce. I think you'd be blacked out. Oh, immediately.
But your head wasn't under the truck, or it was.
My whole body was under the truck, but just the part that fell across was just about 4 inches wide. It was sticking down the lowest point of the truck.
What goes through your mind at that time? What thoughts race through your mind?
Well, first of all, it was incredible pain. I can't even tell you how bad it hurt. But the next thing was that it was probably going to kill me, that I was going to die, because as I'm looking at my body, I'm only 1 inch thick. I'm laying on my back. This large piece of metal has fallen across the middle of my body from side to side. I can't see the lower half of my body from my vantage point, basically laying on the cement. And there's just that little bit of gap between the bottom of the axle on the left and maybe 2 inches on the right. So I know my body is crushed flat across the middle.
So what happens at that point?
He calls 911. He ends up jacking the truck up off my body, and it's at that point that I can see my whole body. And the thought that came to my mind is it looked like it's something like out of a cartoon, a large flat spot.
Well, I bet it really hurt
the middle section of my body. And so I was just panicking and go into shock. 5 arteries severed, 5 places major arteries are severed, so I'm now beginning to bleed out once he jacked the truck up off of me. And so I'm begging him to get me off from the truck. He didn't want to, so I reached back, and I was just underneath the front. I grabbed the bottom of the big bumper with my hands, and basically in an adrenaline rush, I dragged my body out maybe a foot, just so now my head and shoulders are now sticking out from underneath the front bumper. The first responders got there from a local volunteer fire department, because it's in a very rural area of Wisconsin. They got there, and I started to get weaker and weaker, and it's at about that point when I bled out. So when I bled out internally, no more heartbeat, no more pulse, and it was at that point I had a near-death experience. My spirit left my body, and I went up the roof of the garage up about 15 feet.
Lynn, let's talk about that, because this is, not only is it just a medical marvel of how you were put back together and you survived, but Kimberly and myself are, and even Jeff to an extent, are very interested in just the specifics of these near-death experiences. I've been reading about them for 20 years. So you said you left your body. Were you able to look down upon your body? Describe the scene for us.
Yeah, I just watched from at a vantage point of about 15 feet, which is pretty typical just from near-death experiences. As you said, you've been studying, there's 8 to 10 million people in the world alive who've had an out-of-body experience or near-death experience. So my spirit is up in the ceiling. I'm watching from above, completely disconnected from the accident. And one cool thing to note is I watched the people all come into the accident scene. 8 of them came from the front door, 2 came in the back door, and when I spoke to the volunteer fire department a year later, when I got out of the hospital, just to tell them thank you, I was able to pick out 8 of the 10 people who had come to have seen the accident. And of those 8, I picked out the 2 people who come in the back door and just asked them in front of everybody, why did you come in the back door when everybody else came in the front door? Just because the configuration, the way the garage is laid out and everything, it didn't make sense to me. And they had a simple reason. They had missed the first driveway, caught a secondary driveway, come in the back. But what it does is that little details prove, really, it proves that I was in the ceiling. Otherwise, there's no way I could have seen it.
Right, because you're technically dead on the floor with no heartbeat, and you said, as you mentioned, you're out of your body watching this happen. So how can science even explain that?
Exactly. Medicine comes up with some reasons why people have out-of-body experiences, but it denies the spiritual aspect, and it just says it's simply a physical body function. If that were true, then I wouldn't be able to have given the fact that I saw 2 people come in the back door and 8 people come in the front door.
Bruce, walk us through that experience, your state of mind, when you realized, I'm not under the truck, I'm above the truck. Walk us through that whole experience.
Well, I was so disconnected from what was going on below, I didn't even realize that the guy underneath the truck was hurt. I realized it, but I didn't realize that the guy that was hurt was me, rather. I didn't know that that person down there was me. So I'm just watching from above in a perfect sense of peace. I mean, I felt amazing. And the crazy thing was, on each side of my body, I'm watching the medical workers, I'm watching everybody and all that stuff, but the guy that I'm working with, he had jacked up the truck and not used any safety equipment. So he felt responsible. He's crying. He's apologizing. I'm listening to him from above saying stuff like, I should be the one that's dead, not you. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. And I'm just watching all from above. And then all of a sudden, there are these 2 huge angels on each side of my body, about 8 feet tall, based off the other people who are, Leonard is about 6 feet tall, and these angels, their heads stuck up about 2 feet taller than him. They didn't talk to me. I didn't communicate with them in any way, shape, or form. They didn't have wings, just large men about 8 feet tall with long blonde hair, white shining robes, and they had their hands in the middle of my body where I was crushed flat. So I'm just watching all from above. And it seemed very matter of fact. At that point, it didn't seem overly spectacular. It just seemed very, just matter of fact. I'm just watching this happen. You could see that those angels were down there trying to help that guy.
So you knew that they were there to bring help?
Yeah, absolutely. I knew they were there to bring help for that guy that's hurt underneath the truck, but I didn't realize that guy in the truck was me.
After you spoke with the physicians who put you back together, and you had said that it's very unusual for somebody to live through what you went through, were there any unexplained medical aspects to where you felt like those angels laid hands? Was there any connection to how you were hurt and how you recovered with that connection?
Yeah, University of Southern California had done a large study right before my accident happened on the mortality rate of arteries being severed. So they take my case, compare it against that study, and make the claim that at this point, I'm the only person in the world they can find that's had a major artery severed in 5 places and lived. And they say if you have 1 major artery severed, you're going to bleed to death if you can't stop the bleeding 8 to 10 minutes. I had 5, and it was 2 hours and 40 minutes from the minute the truck fell on me until they put those arteries back together. I should have bled to death at about, with multiple arteries, they say 3-4 minutes I should have bled out completely. And that's the point that I did bleed out. That's the point that I lost consciousness and my spirit left my body, when my heart stopped and no more pulse, no more heartbeat. But yet, when the angels showed up and they were touching me in the middle where I was crushed flat, I mentioned 2 of the people came in the back door. Well, one of them, her name is Shannon Fear, and she got down between those angels, and what I didn't know is that she was a Christian lady. I'd never met her. She began to pray and ask God to bring me back to life. And with they're not going to do CPR because I have a chest injury. They're not going to do a defibrillator because I bled out. And this woman prayed me back to life, and that's when my spirit came back into my body. And the first thing I did when I came back in, my heart started, obviously. My eyes opened, I'm looking at her. I looked on either side of my body for the angels. They weren't there that I could see with these fleshly eyes. But this incredible pain comes, and then I realized I was the guy underneath the truck, and it all came back to me, and then I couldn't deal with it anymore. 2 hours and 40 minutes go by before I get med-flighted to the largest trauma center in the state, get put back together, and doctors said I couldn't understand how I made it there because of the length of time, and it made no sense to them. And then they studied the case for a year at this university hospital, and then at the end just said, it makes no sense. There's no medical reason why you should have ever made it here. And I know it's because of the angels.
Bruce, I know that when you first arrived at the hospital and the surgeons opened you up, they described it as your insides looked like a bunch of mush, just because, I mean, obviously you've been crushed by tons and tons of weight. Almost out of time, but your recovery must have been taking years and been very difficult, I'm sure. One other interesting tidbit, there was a guy from New York also named Bruce, who, tell us, if you can, in just a minute or so, what he did and how it affected your intestines. That's really interesting.
When a truck fell across the midsection of my body, spleen, pancreas, small intestines, L4, L5 vertebrae cracked. I mean, everything across the middle. I mean, I was thinner than my spine just a little bit because when it fell down, it hit the L4, L5 vertebrae from the top all the way going through, right? So everything that's in there was crushed and wrecked, and they removed almost all my small intestines. Adults have 18 to 20 some feet of small intestine. I had approximately 2.5 to 3 feet. One of those pieces then died. It wasn't enough for me to, I couldn't eat and live, so they're feeding me intravenously. They gave me about a year to live at the most, so I spend this year in the hospital. In the middle of all that, this guy comes from New York, said God had woke him up 2 mornings in a row and told him, buy plane tickets, fly to Wisconsin, pray for this guy in the hospital. He was going to do a miracle. And when he did, the guy came and prayed for me, laid his hands on me, prayed in the name of Jesus, and immediately, instantaneously, I got 9 to 11 feet, so exactly half of my intestine, small intestine, came back instantaneously. And what's so cool is there's a zillion CAT scans, x-rays, MRIs, all these radiological exams and pictures before and after, and nobody can argue with it. And so when History Channel did my story, they actually tried to disprove it, and they took 24 stories, miracle stories from around the world. They used mine, they saved it for the last story, last episode on a show called Miracles Decoded, and it was the only one out of 24 they couldn't medically disprove because there was so much documentation. I mean, they got before and afters of everything, you know, the arteries, all that. They read all that in the reports, but then the before and after pictures of the intestines, and the intestine doesn't grow back. So
exactly, unbelievable
I'm trying not to cry because I really believe things happen for a reason, and you are truly, truly blessed.
Well, we appreciate you joining us, Bruce.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be on American Medicine Today and telling us and sharing with us your story. Thank you so much. Continued good health, Bruce Van Natta. Thank you.
Thank you
for being on the program.
Have a great one.